Are up to Kuf Amid Beis at the very bottom of the daf. Today's daf is brought to you by. Today's daf is an interesting daf. It's about Isser Chalal Isser. That's the main topic of today's daf. And again, the premise, basically, just to clarify, means you have something that's already prohibited. Does a second Isser Chal on it? Gufa ha'oichel gid hanasha shel behema tmeya. So you eat a gid hanasha of a chazer. So Rabbi Yehuda Mechayev Shtayim. Rabbi Yehuda says you're Asur two Isur. Now, this is an example of Isser Chal al Isser. This is an example of Isser Chal al Isser. The reason being is because the animal starts off as a chazer, so that's the first Isser, and then the Isser of Gid Hanasha is Chal on top of it. When it's born, that's Isser Chal al Isser, assuming that the Isser of Gid Hanasha is when it develops, and sinews develop after the body is formed. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda Mechayev Shtayim. Comes Rav Shimon and he says, Potter legamri. Now that's strange. Rav Shimon says if you eat the chazer's gid hanasha, you're over no isser. Now that's a little bit strange because I would say, give me one isser. Either chazer, and you say, well, the isser gid hanasha is not chal, or, well, there's three choices. You should be chayiv both if you hold the isser chal isser. If you hold there is no such thing as isser chal isser, then it would just be chazer. If you hold that sinews don't have tam, so they're not considered basar, so then there's no isser deraisa of chazer because it's like eating a hoof. But then there should just be Gid Hanasha, because then it's not an example of Isser Chal Isser, because then all I have is Gid Hanasha, because there is no Chazer. Those are the problems. So says the Gemara, Rav Shimon, Manav Shach, I don't understand Rav Shimon. Isser Chal Isser l'chayv v'nam mishum Gid. If it's Isser Chal Isser, it should be Chayv Shtayim. Ein Isser Chal Isser l'chayv mishum tumas t'koydim. And if there's no Isser Chal Isser, it should at least be Asr b'chaz Chazer, because that's the first Isser. V'ein begidim nois in tam. And if you hold that sinews don't have flavor, so they're not included in the basar of Chazer that's prohibited, so it's not Chazer, it's like eating a hoof, then okay, then there's no Isser there, then it should be Gid Hanasha. Why? How could it be one Isser? It's l'chayv mishum Gid. So that's the question. The question is, how is this working here that it should be no Isser at all? So the Gemara says very simple. He believes ein begidim nosin tam, which means there's no flavor in sinews, so it's not chazer. So then why isn't it Gid Hanasha? He has a special drasha that Gid Hanasha only applies to kosher animals. Correct. Says the Gemara, Amarav Eloilim Kasavar Ein Begidim Noisin Tam. Really, he holds that Gidim don't have Tam, so it's not considered Chazer. So why isn't there Gid Hanasha? V'shani Hasam Damar Kra, because the pasuk says regarding Gid Hanasha, Al Kain Lo Yoichlu B'nei Yisrael is a Gid Hanasha. The pasuk says, therefore, Klal Yisrael will not eat the Gid Hanasha, implying it's an animal they could eat, but they're not allowed to eat the Gid Hanasha. But if it's an animal they can't eat, then the Issa doesn't apply. That's the implication of the pasuk. Mi shegidei aser b'sarei muter yatzazu shegidei aser b'sarei aser. Therefore, basically it's exeris hakasiv, the way he reads the pasuk, that Gid Hanasha does not apply to non-kosher animals. Okay. Rav Yehuda Merav ha'oichel Gid Hanasha shel nevela. Okay. So you have a cow. The cow gets shot in the head. So now it's a nevela, and you eat the Gid Hanasha of the nevela cow. So says Rav Meir Mechayev Shtayim. Rav Meir holds Yechayev too, because now this is the explanation is this is an example. This is important to understand. There's Isser Chal Isser conceptually always. Just anytime you have two Isurim, the second one can be Chal. That's one discussion. Then there's an opinion that holds. I don't believe Isser is Chal Isser all the time, but I believe it's Isser Chal Isser when it's an Isser Koilel. And Isser Koilel means if the second Isser is not more severe, but it's more expansive. Okay, it's more expansive, meaning once the Isser is Chal on A, B, and C, it'll also be Chal on D. Not that the second Isser is more severe in punishment or in severity in any way, but it's just it's like a larger blanketed Isser. That's what's happening over here. You have the what's the first Isser? You have Gid Hanasha, right? Because it's a cow, so it starts off with a Gid Hanasha. Then it gets shot in the head. Now the nevela. The question is Isser Chal Isser? Rav Meir says yes, because Rav Meir believes the second Isser is more expensive, because the second Isser of the nevela is Chal on its arm, and it's Chal on its belly, and it's Chal on its ribs. It's Chal on the most of the cow, and therefore it blankets the entire cow, including the Gid Hanasha. That is Rav Meir Shita, because he holds that Isser Chal Isser on an Isser Koilo. Okay. Comes the Rabbanon, the Chum say, Ein Chal Achas. Nope, there is no Isser Chal Isser. You're only Chai for Gid Hanasha, not for nevela. Meaning, because they believe that ein Isser Chal Isser even when it's an Isser Kola. Okay, fine. But says the Gemara, but the Chum do agree that there is one case where it would be Isser Chal Isser, and that is Oichel Gid Hanasha Shel Oila. or shar haniskel. Let's say you have this cow, so it starts with gid anasha, and then you make it a carbon oila. So because the second isser, which affects the entire animal, so right now the whole animal you can't eat, right? So it's an isser kolel, blanket, right? Because it's affecting the whole animal. But it's also a more severe isser, because an isser oila is also bahana. So the second isser is not just an isser achila, it's actually a more severe isser. So if it's an isser kolel that's isser chomer, then it is isser chal isser. That's the chacham shita. Okay. It says the Gemara Shechayv Shtayim. Now the Rabbanan shita is that isser, the ein isser chal isser, even by an isser kolel, but an isser chal isser by an isser kolel, it's an isser chomer. Okay. Now the next part of the Gemara is a little bit strange because I'll tell you why. Man Haitana, who is the author of the Chachamim? To be Isser Koilel, Isser Chal, Isser Lesle. That the Chacham Shita is that there's no Isser Chal, Isser by an Isser Kolel, but Isser Kolel, Isser Chomer, Isle. But they do believe that there's Isser Chal, Isser by an Isser Chomer. Okay. So who is the author of this Chachamim? Now the Gemara, what the Gemara is going to do, let me just say outside, and it's a little bit strange. The Gemara believes that it's a Shita of Rav Yossi. Okay. And it quotes Rav Yossi Shita. Now the problem is, what it quotes is that Rav Yossi does not believe in Isser Chal Isser, even by an Isser Kolel. That's all it quotes. It never proves the other point, that he believes that by an Isser Chomer there is Isser Chal Isser. The Gemara just assumes that the fact that he never addresses that, that's a given. So when it says, who is this Tana, and it quotes Rav Yossi, it's just going to be focusing on the fact that he believes in Isser Chal Isser, even by an Isser Kolel. It doesn't focus on the Isser Chomer component. Isser Kolel is just, it's a more expansive Isser. You have Isser B that just covers more ground, Pasha. So once it covers more ground, it covers the original Isser as well. Rav Yossi does not believe in that, and that will prove. But we never end up touching on the Isser Chomer part. The Gemara just assumes that it's a given because he believes in Isser Chal Isser, Isser Kolel, stop, implying that if the Isser Kolel was an Isser Chomer, he would. That's the Gemara's presumption. Now, Amar Rava, Rav Yossi Haglili. The truth is, it's Rav Yossi Haglili that believes in Isser Chal Isser by Isser Kolel, but Isser Chomer Isle. Why are we letting anybody in? Oh, there's a party later at some point. Amar Rava, Rav Yossi Haglili. It's Rav Yossi Haglili. The Tanan. The Mishnah says like this. We know that if someone is tamei and he eats a carbon, he's chayiv kares. Okay? You're tamei, you eat a carbon, you're chayiv kares. What if I'm tamei and I eat a tamei carbon? So am I also chayiv kares? That's the shaila. So the Chum say yes. The Tanan, good. We're happy noise. Happy noise. The Tanan, Tamei she'achal kodesh, ben kodesh tamei, ben kodesh tahor chayiv. The Chachamim shita is that if someone is tamei and he eats a carbon, he's chayiv kares, even if the carbon is tamei. It doesn't make a difference. That's the Chachamim shita. Okay, that's the Chachamim shita. The Chachamim shita is that if someone is tamei and he eats a carbon, he's chayiv kares, even if the carbon is tamei. Comes Rav Yossi Haglili and he says, no, I disagree. Tamei she'achal as a tahor chayiv, tamei she'achal as a tamei potter. Rav Yossi Haglili says, shliachal davar tamei. Rav Yossi Haglili says that if the person is tamei and the carbon is tamei, he's not chayiv kares. Now stop. Why? So the Gemara at first believes that Rav Yossi Haglili's shita is very practical. It's not a halachic lamdisha iser chal iser shaila. Again, I'm tamei. I eat a carbon which is tamei already. Am I chayiv kares? Rav Yossi says no. The question is why. So the Rabbanan shita, the way I understand Rav Yossi is very simple. It's not an iser kolel, iser chal iser. It's not a lamdisha shaila. It's very practical. The Torah says don't profane a carbon by eating it when you're tamei. If it's already tamei, it's already profaned. That's not what the Torah meant. It's purely like that. The Rabbanan don't like that for the following issue. Then if, let's say that the carbon is tahar, I'm tamei, and I pick it up, and I eat it, it's already tamei. That's definitely chayiv. That's the tzura of eating. It's already profane by the time you put it in your mouth. So how could you say that it's just like what is the Torah worried of me profaning something? And if it's already tamei, it's already profaned. Every time you do that, so what? The only isser of chayiv kares is if someone feeds it into my mouth. Like, come on. So says the Gemara, Amrullah, the Rabbanan said to Rav Yossi Haglili, Af tamei shachal satahar. Every case of someone who's tahar that eats, someone who's tamei who eats a carbon, kivat shenaga by tameu, the second you touch it, you make it tamei. So how could you tell me that it's a shaila of whether you profaned it? It can't be, because not every single time. So the Gemara says, so let me just say it outside. So how does Rav Yossi respond? So the Gemara is going to explain, they misunderstood Rav Yossi. Rav Yossi is not, his svara is not based on a profane or not profane. It's purely halachic, and that is iser chomer and iser chal iser. Iser kola, I'm sorry, like this. When I'm tameh and the food is tahar, then the iser is already chal. But when the food is tameh, right, and then I become tameh subsequently, the question is my iser chal al iser? You understand? Meaning when I'm tahar, when I'm tameh and the meat is tahar, then there's an iser for me to eat it straight up. Of course I'm chayav kares. But if the opposite, this is already tameh, and then I become tameh, so the question when I eat it, is there there's the isser of eating a tameh carbon. There's no kares for that. The question is, now that I'm tameh, is there an additional, is the isser of me being tameh chal al isser? Now this is a more expansive isser, blanketed wise, because I'll tell you why. When this piece of meat is tameh, all it means is that this piece of meat is tameh. But when I become tameh, it means all carbon meat is tameh to me, like that. So it's a more expansive isser. And Rav Yossi Aglili says, ein isser chal isser by isser kola. Now the Gemara is going to point out, what about the fact that the second one is more chamor, right? Because chayiv kares. Right. So the Gemara, and I thought Rav Yossi believes that by isser chamor. So Rav Yossi counters, who says that this is more chamor? Who says which is more chamor? Meaning, who says that tumas carbon and tumas haguf, that tumas haguf is more chamor than tumas carbon? Maybe not. That's how Rav Yossi responds. Well, we'll see it inside. The point is, Rav Yossi acknowledges that, but so the conclusion of the sugya is that the reason why Rav Yossi makes this distinction is not a matter of profane or not profane. It's isser chal, isser shaila, and he believes that even when the second isser is an isser kolel, ain't isser chal isser. Also, inside. So it says the Gemara, Shapir Karmelei Rabban Rav Yossi Aglili. The Rabban make a good point to Rav Yossi Aglili. Every time you eat something that's tahar, you're metameh biyadayim. So says the Gemara. Amar Rava responds, when the person becomes tamei first and then the basar becomes tamei, of course you're chayiv, because the original isser is on the person. The isser kares koidim, because the isser kares is the first thing. Ki pligi, what's the machlokas? Benitma basar v'achar kach nitma haguf. The case is where the carbon became tamei. So this carbon is already usher to eat because it's a tamei carbon. And the question is now that I'm tamei, is my isser chal al isser? To that, Rabbi Yosef Glili says no. Rabbanan islay iser kolel demig the mechav chatichas taharis the alm mechav na mechatichas tameya. Rabbi Yosef Glili lesly iser kol demig alarmin. The shaila is there iser chal iser when the second iser is an iser kolel. This example is the second iser, the tumas haguf, is definitely an iser kolel because when I became tamei, I am now outlawed from all karbanos. That's an iser kolel. Rabbanan believe iser chal iser by iser kolel. Rav Yossi says no, it doesn't. Now, what about the fact that the second iser tumas haguf is more severe? So it says the Gemara of Rav Yossi Haglili, nehida iser kolel lesli b'iser kal yavo iser chomer yochel iser kal umani tumas haguf shari tumas haguf kares. Why don't you say that the fact that the second iser is an iser chomer because it's kares, right? A carbon that's tamei is a lav. A person that's tameh eating a carbon is an isser kares. So that second isser is more chamor. So as the Gemara, Amar Ravashi, man leimelan de tumas haguf chamura. Who says tumas haguf is more chamor? Dilma tumas basar chamura. Delesli tara b'mikvah. Tumas basar you can never fix. You're right. Maybe in severity in kares, tumas haguf is more chamor. But tumas basar also has a severity that tumas haguf doesn't, which is you can never make a carbon that's tameh tahar. I can make a person that's tameh tahar by going to the mikvah. So therefore, Rav Yossi says, if the second one was more chamor, I would agree that it would be. But who says? In this case specifically. Go to the next page. So what we've done now is we've proven that Rav Yossi Haglili does not believe in Isser Kolel, unless the second one is more chamor. Ein Isser Chal Isser, generally, according to Rav Yossi Haglili. Here's the issue. Rav Yossi Haglili less Isser Kolel. Rav Yossi Haglili does not believe in Isser Chal Isser when the second Isser is an Isser Kolel. It's not Elul yet. People started texting me about seats. It's not Elul yet. I don't care we did Mavarchim. No. It's not Elul yet. Anyway, says the Gemara, Rav Yosef Gili doesn't believe in Isser Kolel, Vatanya. But you have the following brisa. Now this brisa is not exactly of Isser Chal Isser. It's a little bit more subtle, but here's the case. Shabbos and Yom Kippur. So you have Yom Kippur is falling on Shabbos. And Shogag v'asa malacha, and a person, lights a match. Accidentally. How many chatas do you burn? Shabbos has a chatas, Yom Kippur has a chatas. So says the Chachamim, say, Menayin shechayev al zeh v'al chayev b'zeh b'atzmai. How do I know that you bring two chatois? Tamalomer Yom HaKippurim hu. Div Rav Yossi Haglili. Rav Yossi Haglili says it's Yom Kippur. Now, by the way, stop. This the Gemara believes is an example of Isser Chal Isser, even though they're both happening at the same time, which generally the same time is not Isser Chal Isser. Okay, but Rashi, the Gemara is going to reject this anyway. But Rashi says this Rav Yossi Haglili believes is an example of Isser Chal Isser. Okay.
Because the pasuk says Yom HaKippurim.
Meaning Dafka, it's always Yom Kippur, even when it's Shabbos. That's the way he reads it. The point is, he believes this is an example of Isser Chal Isser. Shabbos and Yom Kippur being Chal Isser. And what does Rav Yossi Haglili say? You chayv twice. Why? Because when there's an Isser Kolel, it's Chal. Which one's the Isser Kolel? Rashi says both. Yom Kippur is Kolel in that there's an Isser Achila, so it's a more expansive Isser, which Shabbos doesn't have. But Shabbos is an Isser Kolel because it has more severity by the fact that it's Chayv Kares. So therefore, they're both sort of Kolel on each other, and therefore you Chayv too. It's a little bit strange. It was also, by the way, Kolel, more Chomer, whatever. So the point is, here's the Shaila. How could you tell me Rav Yossi Haglili does not believe in Isser Chal Isser? The premise of this framework of Shabbos and Yom Kippur that you're chayiv to is because of Isser Chal Isser. Which one is chal on each other? Both. The Shabbos is chal on Yom Kippur and Yom Kippur is chal on Shabbos. Why? Because there's a severity that both have. Yom Kippur is more severe that there's an Isser Achila. Shabbos is more severe that it's chayiv kares. So therefore, how could you tell me Rav Yossi Haglili does not believe in Isser Chal Isser? Over here it's Isser Chal Isser. Good point? Good. So, Shabbos, not Yom Kippur. No, I'm sorry. Shabbos is Chayiv Misa B'dei Shemayim. Yom Kippur is only Kares. My mistake. So the point is that more Chomer, Misa B'dei Adam. Sorry, Misa B'dei Adam. Yom Kippur is not. Yom Kippur is just Chayiv Kares. So that's an example of Shabbos has more severity of the punishment. Yom Kippur has more severity in that it extends to Isser Chila as well. So says the Gemara, that's an example of Isser Chal Isser. The Rabbi Akiva says Ein Chayiv L'achas. Rabbi Akiva says no, you're only Chayiv for Shabbos, not for Yom Kippur. Okay. By the way, get to a point in a second. Why Shabbos and not Yom Kippur? Okay, we'll get to that. But Rav Akiva says just one, because Ein Isser Chal Isser. So we're just going to go with one. We're going to go with Shabbos. So here's the Shaila. So how could you tell me Rav Yossi Haglili does not believe? Not really. It's a sort of. So the Gemara says. So how could you tell me that Rav Yossi Haglili believes Ein Isser Chal Isser? This is an example of Isser Chal Isser. So the Gemara says you're right. Shalach Ravim Mishum Rav Yossi Bechanina Kach Hatzah Shal Mishnah Epoch. Switch the names. Rav Yossi Haglili says Chayiv Achas. Rav Akiva says Chayiv Shtaim. Okay. Says the Gemara. Now again, and by the way, whoever says the Chayiv Achas, let's go. First version was Rav Akiva. Now it's Rav Yossi Haglili. Which one? Shabbos. You Chayiv Shabbos and not Yom Kippur. The major difference between Shabbos and Yom Kippur is as follows. Says the Gemara. Shalach Rav Yitzchak bar Yaakov bar Guria Mishum Rav Yochanan l'div Rav Yossi Haglili mad Apchan. According to the second version, which is that you're only chayiv one chatas, which is for Shabbos, therefore, shogag b'Shabbos, if you, when you lit the match, forgot it was Shabbos, but hazed be Yom Kippur, but you knew it was Yom Kippur, so you're shogig b'Shabbos, so you're going to be chayiv a chatas, because he holds that the one is for Shabbos, so chayiv. But hazed b'Shabbos, the shogag be Yom Kippur, but if you were mazed b'Shabbos, and shogig on Yom Kippur, then you'd be potter. Then you'd be potter. So why are you potter? Yes, meaning you're potter from a chatas. Well, that's what I thought. 1 second. No, hold on 1 second.
How can make you pay for a chatas?
Yeah. Okay. 1 second. Says the Gemara. Hold on 1 second. I just want to see Rashi for 1 second. I'm sorry. Hold on. Chayiv. Be'isir Yom Kippur sheyidei chayiv chatas. Aval shagag be'isir Yom Kippur. Sheshachar Yom Kippur. Aval yidei Yishu Shabbos. Potter mishtehen. No, you're potter from both. Now the question is. Yeah, the question is why you potter from both. I mean, in the second case, you potter from both. I thought it was because of what Adam said, which is you get the misa. The Gemara says no. The Gemara says my timer. First of all, Why is it that Shabbos takes effect and not Yom Kippur? The whole premise is, first of all, that it's Shabbos and not Yom Kippur. Just stam. You're choosing one. Why Shabbos and not Yom Kippur? So says the Gemara, Amr Abaya. Again, the case in the second case, just remember, is you're mazed b'Shabbos and shaygig b'Yom Kippur. Oh no, it works. It's pasha. You're not chayiv chatas because you're only chayiv for Shabbos and not for Yom Kippur. That's the point. When it's Shabbos and Yom Kippur, you're only chayiv for Shabbos. Yom Kippur is not chal. So therefore, if you're shaygig, what are they doing downstairs? Maybe you could check because I don't know why I hear a machine.
That sounds like a very...
So that can you just for a second? So again, just one quick point. According to Rav Yossi Haglili, you're only chayiv for Shabbos and not for Yom Kippur. So therefore, it's very simple. Hazid b'Shabbos, if you're mazid b'Shabbos, so there's no chatas for that because it's b'mazid, and shagag b'Yom Kippurim, it's potter from a chatas. You're not going to get a chatas mitzad Shabbos because it's b'mazid. You're not going to get a chatas from Yom Kippur because Yom Kippur doesn't count. That's the point. You'll get the death penalty, fine. But the point is, mechatas perspective, meaning in other words, this is just repeating the concept that we only regard Shabbos and not Yom Kippur. So the Gemara says, my timer, why is that? You're going to choose one, because ein is a chal iser, so why are you choosing Shabbos and not Yom Kippur? So Amr Abaya, Shabbos kavia v'kaima, Yom Kippurim beidina de kakavile. The answer is, if you have to believe, ein is a chal iser means that you have the first one, and then the second one's not chal. Which is the first? Well, they're both happening at the same time. So the Gemara says, I think Shabbos is more the first. Why? Why is Shabbos more the first? Because Shabbos is set in the calendar. Before the year began, I could tell you it's going to be Shabbos. I don't know exactly when Yom Kippur is going to be because it depends. Now, even though Saif Kol Saif, once the 10th of Tishrei begins, it begins at the same time. But months out, Shabbos, you always knew Shabbos was coming. Says the Gemara, that's a very nice vart. Amalei Rabba, Saif Trevayda Hadabadei Kasi. It's a very nice vart, but at the end of the day, they're chal at the same time. Like, so what's going on? So why are you choosing Shabbos and not Yom Kippur? Can you close the basement doors if you don't want? So says the Gemara, very simple. A very geshmaka answer. Very geshmaka. Again, the shaila is, you have Shabbos and Yom Kippur, you mechal Shabbos and Yom Kippur, Rav Akiva Shita is, Rav Yossi Haglili Shita is, I'm sorry, we change it, is that you only chayiv one for Shabbos. So why? Ein is a chal iser. Okay, but why are you choosing Shabbos over Yom Kippur? So the Gemara says you misunderstood the case. The whole thing is a misunderstanding. It's not the case at all. The case was as follows. The case, it wasn't Shabbos Yom Kippur. It said Shabbos Yom Kippur. It wasn't Shabbos Yom Kippur. This was a tkufa when the Goyim outlawed Yom Kippur. We couldn't keep Yom Kippur. So the Rabbanan said, listen, you can't keep Yom Kippur, but at least on Shabbos Yom Kippur, even though it's not Yom Kippur, but that Shabbos, keep Yom Kippur as a Zecher Ba'alma. It wasn't Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur that year was really Thursday, but they couldn't keep it because it was a shmad. So they said that year, Shabbos, you should celebrate Yom Kippur. Okay? So the person is Mechal Shabbos, and he's Mechal Yom Kippur. He only brings chatas for Shabbos. Why not Yom Kippur? Because it's not Yom Kippur. That's why. It has nothing to do with Issachal Issa. The whole thing's a mistake. It was mamish, it was like a toast. It was the reason why you're not punished for Yom Kippur, because it's not Yom Kippur. It's a Zecher Ba'alma. Says the Gemara, El Amarava Shmadahava. The truth is, it was a case of Shmad, where they outlawed Yom Kippur. And that year, Visholchu mitam, and they sent a message that year, that this year, let Shabbos be Yom Kippur. But you say, so why Shabbos? I guess because the Goyim wouldn't see, you're off anyway, they're in shul anyway, you're already in shul, so they said, let's just celebrate Yom Kippur this year on Shabbos, even though it wasn't. So you're not going to be punished a chatas for being Mechal Yom Kippur, because it wasn't Yom Kippur. They also said the same word. Okay, just to finish up the daf, we said in the Mishnah, there was a shayla of our non-kosher animals. No, no, change. So it was an example of Issachal Isser, it wasn't Yom Kippur, the whole thing's a toast. Going back to the Mishnah said it was a machlokes tanoim. Is there an isser of gid anasha on non-kosher animals? And the crux of the shaila is, when was the isser of gid anasha given? If it was given by Har Sinai, then Har Sinai it only applies to what Jews can eat, which is kosher animals. The Rav Yehuda says no, it applies to Chazar also. Why? Because it was really given when Yaakov struggled with the Malach. That's where it's written in the Torah. It says Al kibnei Yisrael yechu gid anasha. At that point, they weren't Jews yet. Strange as that may sound, and therefore from the Shvatim's perspective, a cow and a chazer are all the same. So it makes sense that they outlawed animals they could eat all the animals. Okay? So the Gemara says, Tanya, Amr Leila Rav Yehuda, the Rabbanan said to Rav Yehuda that no, the Isser of Gid Anasha was really given by Har Sinai. I'll prove it to you. It's written, and by the way, how did the Rabbanan counter in the Mishnah? They said the Isser was really given by Har Sinai, But when Moshe Rabbeinu wrote the Torah, he wrote that prohibition by the story in Vayishlach because that's where the context was. But really, the Isser was only given by Har Sinai. It was just written basically in the wrong place. So the Gemara says a little bit more of the context of the conversation. Amalei the Rabbanan said to Rabbi, I'll prove it to you. That what? That the Isser was really given by Har Sinai and it was just written earlier. It was written out of place. I'll prove it to you because what's the Lashon? At that time, the Shvatim were not called Bnei Yisrael. Bnei Yisrael is a terminology that we got by Har Sinai. The Shvatim were not called Bnei Yisrael. Maybe Yaakov might have been just given the name Yisrael, but not really, by the way, only by the Malach, not by Hashem. Right? He was given. The point is, the Shvatim were not called Bnei Yisrael at that time. So the fact that the pasuk says in Vayishlach, Al Kein Lo Yechu Bnei Yisrael Es Gidanosha, Bnei Yisrael means when we were called Bnei Yisrael, which is by Har Sinai. Okay. The Haloi Lo Nemer El Bnei Yisrael, V'Lei Nikru Bnei Yisrael at Sinai. So that's a raya that the real Isser was given by Har Sinai. El Basinai Nemer El Shenichta Bim Kaimai Leidem Ezatam Nasar. Really, this was given by Har Sinai when we were called Bnei Yisrael, and it was written in Vayishlach, but like the ode to when it was written, it was called as Bnei Yisrael. Says the Gemara, that's a very nice point. I get it. We were not called Bnei Yisrael at the time. The Shvatim were called Bnei Yaakov. Here's the problem. When were we called Bnei Yisrael? You're telling me by Har Sinai. You know what the pasuk says when they carried Yaakov's body back to Eretz Yisrael? You know what the pasuk says? Vayisu Bnei Yisrael is Yaakovim. It says Bnei Yisrael. So they were called Bnei Yisrael before Har Sinai. So how could you tell me we're only called Bnei Yisrael by Har Sinai? We were called Bnei Yisrael when they carried Yaakovinu's body back. We weren't. It was before Har Sinai. Says the Gemara, Lachar Maisa. Yeah, but that's after Hashem named him Yisrael. Meaning, in other words, you're right. We were called Bnei Yisrael before Har Sinai, but we were not called Bnei Yisrael at that time. The time we were called Bnei Yisrael is after Hashem named him Yisrael, which was later on in the parasha. So the fact that it's written after the Milchama with the Malach Sar Shel Esav, that could not have been written Bnei Yisrael then, because we were not Bnei Yisrael then. We were Bnei Yisrael later on. Not Har Sinai, later on. And the source of us being called Bnei Yisrael, the first time we called Bnei Yisrael was actually carrying Yaakovinu's body back. Says the Gemara, okay, so then it should be Aser. Giranasha should not be Aser from Har Sinai, it should be Aser from the time that we're called Bnei Yisrael, which is when we were Mitzrayim. And at that time we could still eat Chazer, right? Because before Har Sinai, so it's back to the original point. It says the Gemara, Amrlei ends with this, the Torah is not given in groups. In other words, you got a choice. Either the Isser was given at the time of the Milchama, when the Maisa happened, or Har Sinai. The Torah is definitely, the Isser is not given when Klal Yisrael are in Mitzrayim. Like, that's not an option. And therefore, you have a choice, either at the time of the Maisa, or Har Sinai. And we're going to say Har Sinai because the time of the Maisa we're not called Bnei Yisrael. We were called Bnei Yisrael one time in Mitzrayim. We're not given the Isurim then. Says the Gemara, Hahi shaita lav shas Maisa v'lo shas matan Torah hava. I'll stop here.